Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the class tonight. We're glad to have you with us. This is one of our Black History Month events. Before we get started, before I turn the floor over to our speaker tonight, I'd like to make a few announcements. This is our second activity during Black History Month. I hope you joined us for our first with Prince White, who gave a presentation on Ben Davis. So tonight we have Jarvis Tyner speaking on African American leaders in the CPUSA. And I just want to alert everyone to the upcoming conference we'll have on March 3rd, Saturday, March 3rd, from 1 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time, 1 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time. The conference concerns the fight against male supremacy and misogyny. We think the conference will be a very important turning point for us. It'll give us an opportunity to discuss the fight against male supremacy and misogyny from a working class analysis, from a working class perspective. The objective will be to discuss and adopt a sexual harassment policy, to discuss and adopt a statement against male supremacy and misogyny, and to discuss and adopt a listing of best practices and best ideas when it comes to creating spaces favoring equality and the participation of women in particular, but all in general. So we invite you to join us for that conference again on March 3rd from 1 to 6 p.m. Eastern. So at this time, I'll turn the floor over to Jarvis, who will be our presenter tonight.
Thank you, Denise. And I want to thank you for organizing these wonderful webinars that are enjoying some support across the country. We have a nice crowd here in New York, and I know you have one in Chicago, and then over 100 people signed up for this, so I assume we'll have a pretty nice crowd on the internet. First, I want to say this is a very special subject that's close to my heart. Obviously, I spent over 60 years in the Communist Party, and this is Valentine's Day. It's something I want to say. I love you all. I especially love my wife and my family so much. My mother-in-law's out here, and I want to say that turn to the person next to you and tell them that you love them. Because this whole struggle is really, this is a family affair. You know that, right? All across the country. Hug your wife, hug your husband, say hello, and that's good. I know it's been commercialized. This is nothing commercial. You will not have to buy a box of candy from me, honest. Thank you. As I said, my heart's full of love and pride for the Communist Party. The more I learn about it, the more I experience it, the more love I have in my heart and confidence and pride in my heart. Because the fight that they have undertaken, they did almost 100 years ago. Next year, our centennial, was a great fight that upheld working people, and it upheld the rights of women, although we had to grow on that one. But it also upheld the fight against racism and for equality of the African American people, which was a central question to the whole struggle for socialism. You all should know that at the founding of the Communist Party, 1919, that's why next year will be our 100th anniversary. Despite that there were a small number of African Americans who actually attended the founding convention. I think I saw a picture one time of it, and really, you could count them. And that's because at that time, because of the great experience, the great explosion of politics around the world with the Soviet revolution and the Russian growth and building of socialism, the first country to do that, free education, medical care for everybody, subsidized housing, and that they removed a very vicious czarist government which practiced pogroms against the Jewish people and carried out racial oppression against all of the controlling colonies around them. So when they won, everybody who had a sense of justice and freedom and believed in true democracy and socialism and all that were moved. And so that's the people who came here from this country, often escaping poverty and oppression and repression, were already drawn towards the left movement. But when they were put on the outside in this society, when the Communist Party was formed and so on, they joined it. But it was still a small party in the 1920s, but a very important party, as history will show. Now, it's very important to note, some people think the communists just happened out of opportunism to embrace the fight for African American equality, but actually it was deep in their ideology. And the basic beliefs of the Communist Party was for the full, total economic, political, social equality for African Americans, despite its composition. For example, at the founding, the socialists and the communists split. The socialists split from the communists on a critical question, and that is the fight for against racism and for African American equality. The communists believe it was intricately integrated or a part of the whole fight to change the society to a socialist one. But the socialists believe that it was maybe even a diversion away from that fight, and that Black and other people who were oppressed had to wait until after socialism to gain their liberation. So in the great by and by, we would be free. Meantime, they should join them and help them do what they want to do. Now, how are you going to join somebody who had segregated meetings? The old Socialist Party. Debs was great. He got 1 million votes. But when he held meetings in the South for his presidential campaign that he got 1 million votes, Black people had to sit upstairs. He did not challenge, or they did not challenge, the segregated nature of the Deep South and good part of the country as a whole. So there was a big battle on that. And it really was a battle around the strategic approach to how revolution just don't pop in people's head. It really grows out of their experience in resisting oppression. And if it doesn't do that, people go, well, what should I do with this then? So I'm going to tell you a story of Comrade James Jackson, grew up in Richmond, Virginia. His father was a pharmacist. He went to Howard University. He was a registered pharmacist. But when he was a teenager, he saw a sign saying there was a meeting of the Socialist Party. And he went down, whoa, I like that. I want to know more about it. By the way, he was the first Black Eagle Scout in the whole state of Virginia. You know, came from a, quote, prominent family and all that. Ended up at Howard, as I said. But he went to this meeting, and he was directed into the balcony. So he immediately directed himself out the door. If they don't understand this, was his feeling. If they can't figure this out, how the hell are they going to get to socialism? And he was right. And the thing that the Communist Party instilled in its members very young, when I came in 61, even though my life experience had given me a certain understanding and, of course, commitment to the fight against racism and for equality, and harmonize that with socialism, that apparently wasn't happening with the socialists. The other strategic question at the bottom of that is that the Socialist Party in the old days, who were allies on many questions with them, we worked together with them. We were all in one party at one point, actually. Socialist Party was formed in 1870, I mean. And so by 1919, people had grown to the point where they saw the necessity for Communist Party. So the Socialist Party were extremely able street agitators. They were the soapbox party. Their form of developing support in the community was to get out there with a soapbox and have put their best speaker up there to talk about the issues of the day. But they weren't on some of the picket lines that were going on. They certainly were not a part in the fight against racism, but even some of the hardcore questions. And when the communists in the 1930s were putting the furniture back, fighting for relief, and growing like crazy, by the way, during that period, they were still agitating. And as William Z. Foster says, even in the 1930s upsurge, their memberships remained fairly stagnant. I think you can still find the Socialist Labor Party somewhere. They used to have book we call newsstands and so on. But the truth of the matter is that it never grew to the proportion of the party, nor to bringing masses in, much less black masses. But the party still had a problem. There were three very prominent African Americans who attended the convention. One was the Jamaican poet Claude McKay, who was part of a group called the African Blood Brotherhood, which was based in Harlem and I think other places. They had about 2,000 members. They were actually an all-black movement that was led by Marxists. And the leadership of that movement eventually joined the Communist Party after working with Ben Davis and other people. And they, in fact, ended up affiliating officially to the Communist Party of the United States. Another one was Harry Haywood. Harry Haywood was a veteran of the First World War. I think he's with the Harlem Hellfighters. I think Harry Haywood may have had a Caribbean background also. Let me tell you, the Caribbean, the Afro-Caribbeans, they were a great foundation for recruiting African Americans, which they are too, but North Americans, into the Communist Party. They were the foundation in a lot of ways. They were the first ones to come our way. In addition, a comrade named Otto Hunswood, his last name is Huiswoud, Hunswood, I think it's pronounced. He was actually also from the Caribbean. He was from Suriname. And he was a kind of an export-import guy to make a living, but he was also a devout Marxist. And he came into the party. I came into the party in 1961, and Otto must have been 97. He was way up in age. He came and greeted our convention. He could hardly get his speech out, but he got it out. And he was still the revolutionary Marxist-Leninist that he was back in the old days. That was, and therefore, a lot of the people who came from the Caribbean had an anti-imperialist understanding. They had known the national bourgeoisie of their country. In some ways, they had a higher sense of class and so on than maybe native-born did, although native-born also were fighting and militant. But the ideas of Marxism seem to have filtered down to the Caribbean blacks more than here. That's just my guess, but I think that's probably what pretty much happened. So the party formed itself on the basis that the African American equality and liberation was a special question that penetrated the very heart of the fight for socialism, that you could not or should not, and it was wrong to tell African Americans, hold off on the fight against racism. We'll take care of you later. I would say that was a kind of a racist position. Now, you know, Du Bois was a member of the Socialist Party for a long time, but he left. And when he left, he made very clear that they're white chauvinists. That's the way he put it. Now, that doesn't mean all socialists are that we can't work with them and they're all bad guys. Certainly today that is not true. And even back then, all of the initiatives that the party took, particularly in the 1930s, which was a great period of growth and influence of the party, the socialists had some little piece of some of the coalitions that we were part of and so forth. For example, the founding of the National Negro Congress. There were all kinds of civil rights organizations before that. The industrial, what was it called? The thing that Patterson headed up, International Workers Defense Organization was one. That evolved into something else. They had the National Negro Labor Congress that involved, these were all civil rights organizations. At its height, surprisingly, the National Negro Congress actually had more members than the NAACP, you know. And because they entered into the fight around Scottsboro, you know the case of Scottsboro, eight young men riding on a rail car, middle of the Depression, looking for work. They were impoverished, they were broke, they didn't have a job. That's the way you traveled around looking for a place. And then they got into a fight with a bunch of white guys. And when they were arrested by the police in Scottsboro, Alabama, they were arrested, but then they noticed that there were two white women dressed like boys who were hiding in the same car. And they told, I think that had to be the sheriff, told them, look, you're going to be considered dirty or something. You better say that these guys raped you, that they forced you to do it. And they did. And then one of them was only 12 years old, Scottsboro. They lined them up. They arrested them, and then they lined them up for a lynching. And thousands of people came. What is the matter with people? Came to see these kids hung. Basically lynched officially by the state, because the sheriff tried to fight him off, but he was by himself. And this is what some historian told me anyway. But when they got on the thing, they lined them all up on the gallows. They were about to hang them. Thousands came into town. They didn't actually get lined up yet, I think. The International Defense Organization that William L. Patterson headed, Pat was one of the early African-American members of the party. He was not of Caribbean descent, and he was a leader of the International Labor Defense Organization that defended Sacco and Vanzetti. You know that case? Two Italian immigrants who were charged with murder falsely, and they were anarchists fundamentally, and they were very vulnerable to the attacks on them, and they were brought up on charges and faced the life sentence, murder. They were charged with murder, and they faced life, not life, the death penalty. That's what I'm trying to say. So they were up in Boston, and this organization led a terrific fight. Like I say, William L. Patterson, African American, was the leader of the defense thing, and they put up a gallant fight, but they didn't achieve freedom for them. They were hung. Sacco and Vanzetti. They weren't the first one who were hung in labor struggles and political struggles and so on. So they came down and they basically got a lawyer for the Scottsboro youth and got them to stay any execution or whatever, and got them they filed some briefs and so forth, installed it. This was a lawyer from the International Workers Defense Organization that the party had built. This would save them. But the whole story took about 20 years or so for them to win their freedom. And some of them didn't make it. Some of them got in trouble in jail, and others were killed. But they won. The case went to the Supreme Court, and they won. And the reason today there is a court decision that black people or people of color should have their peers on the jury. All white juries are not acceptable, should have their peers on the jury. That was won first through the Supreme Court decision around the Scottsboro youth. Communist Party. Also, at the time of the founding of the party, I'm jumping around a little bit, lynching was rampant in the country. In some parts of the country, Sunday morning after church was a time when a random black was dragged off the street and they would hang them and so on. Or if the charge of rape, God forbid, was made against an African American, they were hung and lynched. And lynching, well, you think these special interrogations of the Bush administration, something, this include mutilation, cutting off fingers and toes. I don't want to get into it. It was hard. And then burning somebody to death as the final thing. What was it for? Terrify the African American people. Now you should know that after Reconstruction, our people have known terror. Maybe more than any people. Maybe the Native American Indians worse, maybe. Although, I don't know, the Long March and all the other shooting them down and killing them. But when Reconstruction was collapsing and they pulled the troops out, I've seen figures that say 60,000 blacks were murdered or terrorized in that period. And you've heard of Ida B. Wells. She and W.E.B. Du Bois worked with her, and also another person I'll tell you about. But they worked together. But Du Bois was not in the Communist Party. He was still kind of a philosophical socialist, but I don't think he was organized in that group. Ida B. Wells, this outstanding fighter, black woman, who had led this whole struggle against lynching. Sunday morning was lynch. Sunday after church was lynch time. It was that how people thought it was entertainment. You ever see those pictures of somebody being lynched and people standing around? Can you imagine the dehumanization that it requires to think that's funny or entertainment and so forth? But still what was maintained and what the party tapped into, they had white members who understood this, and was that this sort of thing was murder, and that they believed African Americans were not human, but the party believed they were not only human, but they should be liberated and free and equal to everyone else. That's what attracted them. Ossie Davis, who some of you may know, and I had the pleasure of meeting him and Ruby more than once. He actually knew my first name. And Ossie was asked, they were celebrating the centennial of Robeson. And Ossie was asked, why was Robeson attracted to the communist thing? He was great. He was famous. I want to talk about him in a minute. And he said, the simplest answer I've ever heard, which to me, it touched me. And I'm just paraphrasing. He said, our people are treated like animals. He said they are lynching us in the South. They won't give us decent education. In the North, we can't find jobs. We can't get decent housing. Our people are facing police brutality every day and so on. He lit this whole list. The communists said, we will join you in that fight. And it was black and white and brown coming together in that fight. And the consequence of that would give people an understanding we can win this thing. If we have whites on our side who understand what's going on and appreciate it, we can win this thing. And so he said, that's why we had no choice, says Ossie, but to work with the communists. That's the first time I ever, he said that in an interview in the Daily News. And he became, for all of his life, a fellow comrade. He wasn't a comrade, but he was a friend of the party. Him and Ruby, both wonderful people who understood what was at stake. Now, Paul Robeson, whose membership in the party was not public, but I will tell you, some people say they know he was in the party and they know he paid his dues and all that, but it was a decision, a collective decision, that he not make it public. That is why people don't notice, but Paul Robeson, or maybe some of you do notice, I know some of y'all here notice, Paul Robeson was the biggest concert performer in the country and all over Europe from 1930 to 1940. He was the best known African American out there. And he was a movie star. Y'all know that. He was one of the first black movie stars. He did movie. And he was a brilliant athlete. You know, he came out of Rutgers University, 16 varsity letters. But on top of that, he was one of the first. They wouldn't let him on the football team. Some of you may have read that story. He went on. He tried out. You know, he was 6'4" and quite a physical specimen. He tried out for the team, and they tried to deny him, but they couldn't. He was the fastest, strongest, best player they had. So they put him out there, but some of the players decided they were going to hurt him. And there's this whole scene where they tried to injure him. It didn't work. And he went on to break all records at Rutgers University. And he went to law school at Columbia while during the football season, he was playing professional football. He was a Renaissance man. You know what I'm saying? He spoke 16 different languages, ultimately. He's just a brilliant. He spoke, he wrote, he was Othello. In Shakespearean theater, everybody knows he was the best Othello there was. And he sang just magnificently. He was a huge, huge, huge figure. So they figure if his association with the party is seen as an actual membership, Robeson will face total attacks and isolation and so on, which he faced kind of anyway. But that was a decision. And I know at one hearing he had, they called him down to investigate him to Washington, to one of these anti-communist McCarthy hearings. And he gave him hell. He didn't accept this stuff. He told them what he thought right before them. And the decision but the first time he went down was, don't say you're in the party, or that you are or you're not. Don't say either way. The second time he went down there, he openly said to the committee, my friends always tell me, don't say this to you. He says, I'm not going to answer your question whether I'm in the party, yes or no. I used to say no, but I'm not going to answer yes or no. So he was moving towards a totally different position. The other thing was, when he walked out of one of those hearings, some smart-ass reporter stuck a mic in front of him and said, Mr. Robeson, if you like Russia so much, why don't you move there? So he said, my father was a slave. My people had given their lives to build this country. You know the whole thing y'all heard at the first class about how it was the labor of African Americans that laid the economic foundation for the development of American capitalism. He said, my people have given their lives. We have faced all kinds of humiliation and danger and terror against us and so on. I'm not going there. I'm going to fight for this country, and it's going to be mine as much as it is yours. That I'm paraphrasing, but that's what he told the guy. That famous quote. And of course, his other one as an artist can fight for freedom or oppression, and I have chosen my role. I'm going to fight for freedom. I'm going to fight on the right side. But there was another one when Truman had somehow called him, some committee under Truman had called him down, I forget the name of it, Dice Committee or something like that. And when he came out, some smart-ass reporter asked him, hey, Mr. Robeson, are you ready, if a lyncher comes up to you, are you ready to turn the other cheek? He said, no, if a lyncher comes up to him, I'll tear his head off. All I can say is go ahead, Paul. And he meant it. That was the great Paul Robeson.
Jarvis, we're having trouble with the mic. The mic is giving static.
Every time I talk?
It's very bad.
I'm too close or something, or we should turn it down?
No, something has happened. For some reason,
always happens to me. Yeah, well, is it still making that noise when I talk now? gonna call back. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Is it still making noise?
Yeah. For some reason, the mic has become has become ridden with static. So I don't know if the technician there in New York can do anything.
It's getting static when I talk.
Yes, still.
Okay. Closer will get more static, I think. Is it better this way?
No.
That's what I thought. Well, Steven's looking at it.
Okay.
Should I keep going?
It's static and it's an echo.
Okay.
And the only two mics that are open are yours and mine. And when you're speaking, I close mine. So it may be, is someone there does someone there have the webinar open online?
Okay. Steven's going to check on that. I'll wait.
If someone there has the webinar open online, they need to close it.
Okay. We're going to find out in a minute. It's on the other side of the room.
You're fine. It must be, I think it's just me.
It's not just me. They're hearing it in New York as well. I mean, sorry,
All right.
at the Chicago office as well.
Can you hear me now? You want me to talk?
Now it's clear.
That was clear?
Yes.
Okay, good. Good. Where am I?
What was it?
No, he said it was other places we're hearing it.
The significant thing about what I said earlier was that the party started off with very few African Americans, but between the Scottsboro, the whole case, I'm going to talk about Angela Herndon in a minute. All these cases and all the work that the party was doing, putting people who were evicted back into their homes during the Great Depression, hooking people's electricity back up and so on. I have a little family story I want to tell you. I go to my great aunt, who was a wonderful lady, my father's sister, who passed, and she had a beauty shop in Harlem for many years, just like my mother had in Philadelphia. And we went to her funeral, and it was a very sad thing. But my aunt, who was married to her brother and my uncle, said, "Man, what's the matter with you? I hear you fooling around with that communism thing." Yeah. And I'm about to give her a lecture. And the patriarch of the family, the guy who had the best job and the most stable income, and who had lived in a 5-floor walk-up when he first came from the South, and after the war, he got a job with the government and he got a pension. And he got, everybody thought he was like the example for everybody. He said, "No, you don't have to say anything. Listen, that apartment you're living in now, do you know that we were evicted back in the 30s, and it was the communists who put us back in there?" And he said, Ben Davis and the Communist Party were the best friends we had living in Harlem back in the day. And I go, whoa, Uncle Cicero, pretty good. But you can't erase it in a lot of ways. Just recently, we tried to get a street named after Ben Davis. And I'll tell you Ben Davis is in a minute, and that's related to Angela Herndon. And I go to a community meeting, and the people at the community meeting are all kinds of ages, including several white couples who have bought the brown. Harlem is the brownstone capital of New York now. You can get a brownstone up there, and a lot of people are gentrifying in there, and they still are. And when I started to talk to them about naming the street, he lived on 126th Street after them, which we didn't win, by the way, but we're naming the street after him. The community board on the street said, "You ain't got to argue with us about Ben Davis. What y'all gonna do? You're gonna put a statue of him down the street?" I said, "We can't afford a statue. We're just gonna put a plaque and change the name. You ought to put a statue down there for Ben Davis," she told me. And when we had a meeting up in Harlem to celebrate then, some people went into Sylvia's and tried to put some leaflets on the cashier area, you know, when you check out. And the person, what you got there? Let me see. Ben Davis canned them out in the place here. I'm telling you, this is our people. They were revolutionary minded. But at least they understood the necessity for big changes in a basic way about the society, and not just little stuff or be nice to us, or we'll someday when we act nice, we'll get a better shot. They understood way beyond that. And you see it in that vote in Alabama, still there. I'm telling you, and it gets stronger and stronger. 80, 90% of African Americans voting against the extreme right. How is that possible? So, whoa. Where should I take this? When the Mussolini government attacked Republic Spain, people know about that. What year was that? 36, something like that? Huh? The Ethiopian was before that, right? The Ethiopian was before that, where they dropped tax and carpet bombed the Ethiopian people. There was a big upsurge in Harlem, and the communists were right in the middle of it. Thousands went out and marched against the fascists and the racism of them and so on. But I'm talking about the fight for Republican Spain too. People think we were marginal. African Americans were supposed to be marginal. Hundreds of African Americans went to Spain and fought against fascists in the in the 30s. I think it was the early 30s. I think it's more like the mid 30s, I think. And what was significant, it was the first time that black, white, and brown were in the same army unit for this country. First time. Also, that there were black officers above white soldiers. First time happened in Spain. And Henry Winston, who was the national chairman of the party years later after 61, he was the head of the Young Communist League then, which had a huge membership. I think at the maximum 40,000 members around the country. And his job was to recruit people to go to Spain. And so a lot of people went to Spain. We had people in the party years later who went to Spain, still around, or had relatives that died or were in Spain. In Philadelphia, where I came into the party, there was a guy named Rochester. That was his last name. I don't know his first name. We only knew him as Rochester. And he was a fighter in Spain, African American, but other African Americans. Harry Haywood was a commander. Harry Haywood was a commander. He had experience in First World War. So he was a commander in Spain. Over white troops, black troops, all troops. They were other than that. Paul Robeson went there and sung to them right on the street. Louise Patterson went there and did support work for them and so on. There were black women nurses. Some of them came right out of Harlem Hospital. We have not been peripheral to this revolutionary movement, and will never be peripheral to this revolutionary movement. Already right in the heart of it. And the party had the best understanding. It made mistakes. I don't know anybody who's perfect, or political movement who's perfect. We made mistakes. But especially when we had the attack on the McCarthy period in the 50s and people were panicking. You should know, we had just recruited a whole bunch of I wasn't there, I'm just saying, African-American new members. And the decision was, we're all going to go to jail. So the first thing we should do is drop all the new people from membership. And unfortunately, it happened along racial lines. They never rebuilt that either. I mean, never rebuilt it on that level, but it was rebuilt. The African Americans have always been a strong and organized and active group in the Communist Party. In 1934, they took a census of the party, and they had at the 8th convention in Cleveland, they had 24,500 members. 2,500, in other words, 2,500 were Negroes, as it says. 5,000 were youth, and 11,000 were members of the Young Communist League. But that was in 34. The next convention in 36, the 9th convention, they had 41,000 members of the party. They almost doubled their size. And they had the approach that when it comes to a convention, you build it, you organize it, and so on. Now, I am talked a lot about the Harlem activities, but Ben Davis, who joined the party, he was the son of a wealthy African-American businessman in Georgia. In fact, as you know the history, the Republican Party was the anti-slavery party, and the Democrats were the slavery party. That was back then. That's kind of changed now. The Republican Party had no distinguished members in Georgia to represent them. And so Ben Davis's father was a representative of the Republican Party in the state of Georgia in the 30s. All right. That meant when Ben was growing up, he wasn't wanting for anything. His family was well off. His father owned a chain of newspapers, black newspapers in the South. Ben Davis experienced the pride, in a way, of watching his father sitting in his living room, and white guys or white people, white politicians would come to his father and get tribute from the National Republican Party. He controlled the treasury of the Republican Party in the state of Georgia. That's the kind of family he came. So that's also why he ended up going to Amherst College, very exclusive men's college in Massachusetts, Western Mass, and going to Harvard Law School. Same school that Du Bois went to early. I think Du Bois was the second or first or third African-American to graduate from there. Then graduated with honors. But on top of that, he was a great football player, another big guy from Georgia. And he had a great record as an athlete also. So he goes back. This guy had not experienced the hard, sort of harsh realities of Jim Crow like some other people. He came from, as I say, a well-off family who had establishment links. But he heard about a young black man named Angelo Herndon, who was organizing, he was a member of the YCL, Young Communist League, who was organizing in the South black and white farmers and sharecroppers to fight for jobs and better pay for their crops. And Angelo Herndon was leading them on a march for bread or jobs or bread or something like that. It was said jobs or relief or something like that. He was arrested and he was charged with sedition. And he faced the death penalty for organizing blacks and whites to march for that issue of jobs and end poverty and a fair shake for the farmers, the poor farmers, and black and white marched with him in the South. So Ben Davis heard about him and he couldn't get a lawyer. No lawyer would come near him. So Ben, this kind of naive guy, he came and offered himself as his lawyer. And he was brilliant, except the judge kept calling him the N-word and shut up and sit down, you so-and-so. And Ben he wasn't very experienced. He could hardly get his words out that this judge was insulting him. Angelo Herndon was convicted, but because Ben had been there to make motions and so forth, and he had assistance from other lawyers, he got a new trial, which actually went up to the Supreme Court, and Angelo Herndon was free. He got free. So Ben was then, when Ben heard the arguments, let me put it this way, at the trial, in order to get Angelo free, he had to fight against anti-communism. Because they were saying he's from Moscow, he's a conspirator, he wants to overthrow the country. And Ben, they called in so-called experts, which were party people, who were able to talk about what the party was really all about. And Ben said, I kind of think that way. Out of that experience, Ben Davis joined the Communist Party. And he stayed down there. He was the district organizer of the party in Georgia after the Herndon affair. I don't know how long he was down there, but he got a call one day after he discussed the situation he faced. And comrade said, Ben, I think you better go up to New York because it's getting dangerous down there. They were doing things to him, threatening him and so forth. He came to New York. He worked on the Daily Worker for a period of time. I think he was the editor of the Daily Worker for a period of time. And then they said, Ben, we want you to go up to Harlem and become the party organizer in Harlem. This is in the 30s. So Ben said, okay, I'm ready. So Ben went up and he led the most successful grassroots party organization in the country by a communist, maybe around the world, because in Dimitroff's report at the Seventh World Congress in 35 or 37? 35. When he gave his report, a part of it, read it, says, we have learned about popular front politics from the example of the Communist Party in the U.S. And he started naming things we were doing in the community, and they were examples that came out of Harlem. We were not periphery to this thing. We were right in the middle of this. And so one could argue that rather than us taking orders from the communists, they were taking our example to apply to how to build a broad movement. And in this case, the broad movement was to defeat the fascists, Wehrmacht, the Germans, the Nazis, the Berlin, Rome, Tokyo axis. All right. So this question has had a tremendous impact on revolutionary thinking and so forth over 100 years that we have been associated with it and before. The Civil War was the longest, bloodiest war in the history of the United States. And what was it over? It was over the existence of the system of slavery. Don't go for that nonsense. It was to prevent the secession of the states. Why were they seceding? They were seceding so that they could have slavery as a system of free labor, which made trillions of dollars for them. It was the richest people. There were a period when the richest people in the United States were the slave-owning forces. They owned more and were very powerful in the Congress. You know, there was this guy, I can't think of his name. Anyway, I don't want to go into it. But you can look up the history. The wonderful stuff has been written. When World War II came along, the communists organized, and thousands of communists went to fight fascists, and especially those who had had the experience in Spain. They grew to be platoon leaders, lieutenants, captains, and so forth, because they had the most experience with military fighting. Now, there is this thing that early in the war, the Soviet Union signed a pact with the Germans because they were not ready for war, and the Germans were. The Germans had been building for war for a long time. Don't invade us. You know, we won't invade you. You don't invade us, and so forth. And then, they made such a big that the Soviets were not anti-fascist. But who was it that turned the tide of the war ultimately when they got ready and started and militarily had to take on, and the fascists invaded the Ukraine and so on? They had, the USSR lost more casualties than any country. 22 million died. Somebody said it was even a higher number. They were invaded. Moscow was surrounded at one point. They were fighting for their lives. People, some of them were hungry and starving. Others were fighting. And they ultimately, especially in a place called Stalingrad, which is now called Volgograd, the Soviet resistance not only fought back, but held back. Almost a small group of them held back hundreds, even thousands of Nazi soldiers were trying to take over. All over the world, the radio, newspapers were talking about what's going to happen in Stalingrad. And one of the reasons why the U.S. was afraid to go into the war in the early stages was they were hoping that the Germans would wipe out the Soviet Union, and then maybe we can make a deal with the Germans. That was our ruling class. You remember, the fight for a second front was to, in fact, the U.S. and others to come in, because they were out to crush Eastern Europe and in that way win the war. But the Soviets would help. They got supplies and so forth, but not soldiers, were able to turn around the Nazis in Stalingrad, which even Roosevelt, who did some good things, but Roosevelt said that was a turning point of the war against fascism. So I don't know how you get to a turning point and 22 million dead if you didn't want to fight. They obviously did want to fight, and they needed to prepare to fight. So that happened. I joined the party in 1961 after the McCarthy period. During the McCarthy period, I don't have time to talk about a lot of it, but there were some special targets among African Americans. There were communists, there were black communists, and the people who were attacked under the Smith Act. Smith was a arch segregationist, think from Virginia, and his bill actually called the Communist Party a spy organization. That's essentially how they had it, and they called for the communists to they basically prosecuted them on the basis that they were trying to violently overthrow the government of the United States. And the party said, we are working for a peaceful transition to socialism, which is true. We're still working for a peaceful transition. So that doesn't mean that there won't be a fight at some point. The civil rights movement worked for a peaceful transition away from Jim Crow. If you remember, right? They were beautiful in their discipline and so forth and so on. And ultimately, they went on a political basis. We want to win on a political basis ultimately. So they said that, and they argued that, and eventually went to the Supreme Court, and they won the case. But in the meantime, 10 top leaders of the Communist Party were put into jail. Henry Winston, who later became the national chair in 1961, he had 7 years in prison. And while in prison, he developed a tumor on his brain, which impinged on his optical nerves, and he was having excruciating headaches. He's an African-American man, and came from Mississippi, by the way, eventually joined the Hunger March in the 1930s and ended up in the top leadership of the party. But Winston was having these excruciating headaches and telling the people in the prison authorities that he can't stand it. Pain is unbearable, and they gave him aspirins. But party attorney John App went in and saw the condition that Winston was in, and came out and led a whole movement to free Henry Winston. Free Henry Winston. If we don't get Winnie out of jail, he's not going to survive. And when JFK was elected, don't tell me about bourgeois candidates, JFK was elected, and JFK accepted that petition that Henry Winston should get pardoned and get out of jail for a health reason. And he did. He had already lost much of his sight, only had a little bit of sight left. He took an operation here. He went to the Soviet Union, had another operation. He had some special treatment, and it preserved just a line of sight that he could have, I think really on one eye. But he served from 1960 to well in the 80s as the national chair of the Communist Party. That was Henry Winston, and he was my mentor. And he was a kind, beautiful man. And I want to read something. And he played a big role in the defense of Angela Davis, which I haven't. See, this is a problem with the time they give. I haven't talked about Angela and how the party really had a great breakthrough on that. Well, maybe I'll just say a little bit. Bear with me. Angela's case was about her party membership, and she was teaching in the UCLA in LA, and Reagan was the governor. He later went to become president. He was the governor then, and Reagan said there was a Subversive Activities Control Board, another repressive committee of government that was holding hearings around the country, and they got to LA and they held a hearing, and one of the people who was testifying against us was a guy named Bill DeValley. Nicest guy you ever want to meet. But he was squealing on us, you might say. So Bill DeValley, when he got to go to the hearings and all the students, they went to his dorm room and tied his sheets and just made it life hard. He couldn't stay on the campus anymore. So he said, if you don't leave me alone, I'm going to tell on somebody. There's a communist working on the campus of UCLA, professor. And he blew out Angela's name. Well, Reagan had to do something about that, so they fired her. But the Department of Philosophy, where she was working, raised the money to pay her a salary. Her colleagues raised the money to pay her salary, and she had lectures with over 1,000 students coming to hear her lecture on philosophy. So this was a big defeat. But then she was active in defense of the Black Panther Party. You all may have seen the movie. We're going to show the movie here. It's a great piece of history. And Angela, who's not in the party anymore, but I think a very good friend of the party. I have a quote from her. I think that says it all. But Angela, her trial ended up with an all-white jury. But this wasn't Scottsboro. This was California in 1960s. And that jury ultimately and unanimously acquitted her. So Angela won her freedom. First, she won a right to bail, which was a broad movement, including NAACP and all these others, which an ally. NAACP was an ally on this and many other questions. And then she actually won that case. But in the meantime, thousands of people joined the Communist Party, particularly African Americans. I can tell you, in a weekend in Chicago, students came from Ohio, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, so forth. 70 African Americans came to hear Henry Winston in a church on the south side of Chicago. I made a talk on the youth question, and he made a talk on the fight against racism. That day, we recruited 70 new members to the Communist Party, young, Black students, beautiful young people who came into the party. And that was typical. The whole Angela movement had created a whole network of new people coming to the party. It was a great leap in terms of our growth and influence in the African American community. Let me cut it short now, please. First, I'm going to read Angela on Henry Winston. This was done, we had a tribute to Henry Winston right in this building on the second floor then. And it was the 100th anniversary tribute to him. This is Angela Davis's speech. Finally, she said, "It is important that we honor the life and legacy of Henry Winston. But we must also recognize that Henry Winston was not a great man, in spite of being a Marxist-Leninist. He became a great man because he was a Marxist-Leninist. He was not a great man in spite of being a member of the Communist Party. He became a great man because he was a member of the Communist Party. Nothing in his contributions makes sense if you separate from the party and its ideology, if you separate him from the party and their ideology. And yet, his legacy belongs not just to Marxist Lenin or the Communist Party. His legacy belongs to the African American people, to the working class, and to the oppressed people all across the world who strive for a better society and a better future." She wrote that one after she was not a member of the party anymore, but she, like I said, is a friend and has been, and has spoke here many times and so on, and remains a principled Marxist-Leninist thinker. Finally, there's another thing I want to read to you, and then I'll stop for questions because I think I've taken too long. When I'm looking for something very important here. Oh, here it is. When Ben Davis was working up in Harlem with Adam Clayton Powell, who was the first Black elected to the Congress of the U.S. Congress, when he left to go to Congress, he had a city council seat that he had in Harlem. And he asked Ben Davis, would he lead the committee to find, somebody to run for his seat? And after a couple of weeks, he called Ben and he said, "Ben, I've been thinking about it, man. The only guy I know who could do this is you." And Ben ran and became the first, there was Peter Cacchione in Brooklyn who was a communist, and Ben Davis, they were a team, Black and white. And they did some great things in the New York City Council. But here's what Adam Clayton Powell said. "Today, there is no group in America, including the Christian churches, that practices racial brotherhood 1/10 as much as the Communist Party." That was Adam Clayton Powell saying that. And finally, W.B. Du Bois, the father of sociology, foremost scholar in the history of our nation, if you ask me, ain't nothing black, white, I don't care who they are. Du Bois was a giant. He's the one who said the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. So he's the one who said the cost of liberty is less than the price of repression. Some people are saying that today. He's the one who said, I believe in the ultimate triumph of some form of socialism the world over. That is common ownership and control of the means of production and equality of income. That's him. And then he said something else. Either America will destroy ignorance or ignorance will destroy America. You think about that guy we got in the White House? There you go. But finally, let me say this. Martin Luther King gave a great tribute to W.B. Du Bois at his 100th centennial, sponsored by Freedom Ways magazine. And he made the following point. There was a lot of intrigue around his speaking because people were scared he'd get red baited if he spoke about Du Bois being a member of the party. Du Bois joined the party in 1961, went to Ghana, worked on the Encyclopedia Africana, and then died there in 1963, right on the eve of the Big March, by the way. He was the father of the modern civil rights movement, W.E.B. Du Bois. But he joined the Communist Party in 1961. And so when King was coming, I know what was going on in our circles. Don't mention the Communist Party. We'll put King in a bad way, blah, 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 blah. And first of all, what's the name? The great writer, James Baldwin, made a great speech, but he never mentioned the Communist Party, but he said everything but that. I think he got the memo. But somehow, Martin Luther King didn't get the memo, because here's what he said. We cannot talk about Dr. Du Bois without recognizing that he was a radical all his life. Some people would like to ignore the fact that he was a communist in his later years. It is worth noting that Abraham Lincoln warmly welcomed the support of Karl Marx, and that's true, during the Civil War, and corresponded with him freely. In contemporary life, the English-speaking world has no difficulties with the fact that Sean O'Casey was a literary giant of the 20th century and a communist, and that Pablo Neruda, in general, considered the greatest living poet, though he also served in the Chilean Senate as a communist. It is time to cease muting the fact that W.B. Du Bois was a genius and chose to be a communist. Our irrational, obsessive anti-communism had led us into too many quagmires to be retained as if it were a mode of scientific thinking. That was Dr. Martin Luther King. He was not a comrade. He was a great democratic revolutionary, probably the greatest we've had in this period. And he grew after harassment and all kinds of attempts to red bait him, including J. Edgar Hoover calling him the biggest liar in America. That's the biggest liar in America, calling one of the greatest truth tellers, you know. Comrades, this pride that I spoke about, it's not a joke. It's not just a loyalty. I've seen it. Most of these people I've met, I know. We've had some wonderful leaders, black leaders in the party. There was a time when most of the districts of the party had black chairs, district organizer, and a lot still do today. Even the party is diminished after 1991, but growing back. I forget what the number is. Maybe somebody on the phone could tell us, but we are growing by hundreds every month on the internet, people joining on the internet. And by the way, if you're not a member, you can certainly become one. But the main point I want to make is the enemy was so afraid of black people becoming members of the Communist Party that they spent billions to do intelligence work in our community. I was a victim of the COINTEL program, which was the FBI program to discredit. It started with Robeson in Africa, but to discredit the communists and discredit anybody who would associate with the Communist Party. And it had its impact, although, as I said, just like my uncle in that funeral thing, people still appreciate the great strength and power of the Communist Party because we have a record. Now, you could say somebody's a phony if they come around and start talking stuff to you for a week. But when you talk stuff for 90 years, you got to start believing it. It's real. People are sincere. Went to the South in the 1920s, communists, and fought and built a sharecroppers movement. They had 12,000 members in the sharecroppers union that the communists built in the South up to the 30s. You had, I mentioned people working in the Southern Negro Youth Congress and the Conference for Southern Welfare, I think it was called, where Du Bois was the main inspiration of it. I know I'm spinning off on something here, but it's something I want to tell you all about the party, and it went right out of my head. So maybe we'll take some questions, and it'll think of it later. All right. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's open the floor for questions. Those of you in New York and in Chicago can ask questions, and those of you online, if you'd like to ask a question, please click the picture of the hand, click the picture of the raised hand icon, and that'll let us know you want to ask a question or make a comment, and we'll be able to open your mic. So are there any questions in Chicago, Carrie?
Are there any questions? I got some answers. Not just yet.
Okay, okay. Edward, your mic is open. Edward.
I'm here. Brother, I'd like to say that I really appreciate your thoughts, and really a lot of the notions that you offered here are thought-provoking, and my mind is just racing, comprehending so much. You know, one of the things, a couple of things that you stated, and it got me thinking, is that oftentimes I feel that there is an absence of knowledge, particularly for African Americans, as it relates to many of the great heroes found right here within a party in a work, whether it's folks like James Yates, Oliver Laws, you were talking about Spain early on, and some of the other folks that you mentioned here too. I think there should be a particular campaign as we reach out to African Americans in terms of educating them on part of their legacy, their history, and what the party has done, and particularly for folks that many people just don't know about. This is just, it's an educational element. I know here in Boston that we are spending some time this month as part of Black History Month, really introducing folks to comrades in a party or close friends to the party and what they've done. So I'm going to chime out here, but I appreciate your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you. First of all, you all know that next year's our centennial for the party. You know, just like in 36 or 34, they recruited 20,000 new members for the next convention in 36. I think we have to look at our centennials that way. And one of the things we need is a special approach to African Americans, Latinos, immigrants, and so forth to join this party. I think it's very, very, very important that we do it. And we have to put our best face forward. And we have to find a way to educate and show people they already know what's going on, but to show them that the party is part and parcel of what can help to move that struggle forward. And that should be a part or certainly be friendly to our party. So I agree with the proposal that we need a campaign to reach out, not just to blacks, but to whites as well. We have the situation back when I was head of the youth organization, YWLL. And by the way, a lot of YWLL members remain active and friendly to the party. Some, when they reached a certain point, went on and made their careers and so forth. I don't hold anything against them. And you don't have to be a lifetime communist to make a contribution, like a lifetime like me. But there are a lot of like me. But at the same time, you're a friend. You got a friend here. Work with us. Be part of us. help us to do our mission. It's very important. But anyway, I'm thinking that wonderful young people, a lot of African Americans. I told you about what happened in 1970. You know, some great comrades, like my buddy Tony Montero. He was in that effort, and we brought a lot of people in. Bob Rhodes. We brought a lot of people into the party, and it made us strong. And I think whatever life brings, you can move on. It's a volunteer organization, and to me, moving on, probably you can fight for your principles and do what you think is the right thing to do. Uh, but we're your ally. We're your ally. As long as you're in the struggle doing the right thing, we're your ally. And we should be treated that way. There are a lot of people like that now who are out there, and we're reaching out to them. And the centennial will be a way we'll do it.
Okay. Lowell, your mic is open.
Brother, I am in awe of your presentation, and clearly we need a part 2 and 3 of your words, particularly about the African Black Brotherhood, which I've been reading about. I would love to hear a lot more at a different webinar about that. And you mentioned Angela Davis. I would love to hear more about that, and Charlene Mitchell and other Black comrades who served with such devotion in the party. So I would hopefully we can get to schedule that. You mentioned in the beginning about turning to your neighbor and showing some love. I want to show some love to Dee, who has hosted since I joined all of these webinars, and we need to give it up for her. I mean, she's been phenomenal. And before I ask my question, we definitely have to show her some love and for her devotion to doing these webinars. Thank you. Yes. So my question after all that, you kind of touched on it at the end of your speech. This centenary is coming up next year. I am really devoted as a Black gay man, and I'm calling you right now from Hawaii, where I've just moved, and I would love to have this party revived here in Hawaii, where it was Hawaii. Yes, I'm in Hawaii, and the party was destroyed by the FBI in 1956.
Right.
And we need it. We need it here direly, as we need it across the country. But I think it's time for our 100 years to consider. And I'm going to get your feedback on this, because I really want to get more Blacks and Latinos into this party, which has served us for 100 years. It's time for us to get a Black, lesbian, openly communist woman as the head of this party. And this is no disrespect to you or to Dee or to any of the people who are serving this party with such devotion. But I think it's time to do that. And you know who I'm talking about, who we need to draft back into this party to lead this party next year. And it would not just be a symbolic, cosmetic thing that would happen, but it would also be a great recruitment to this party for the people that you want and we need to work to build this party. I guess that's the question. Get your opinion on that, but that's my statement. So I want your feedback. Thank you. And thank you, Dee. Thank you very much, Dee.
Okay, thank you. Well, as I told Angela, I think, whenever you're ready to come back in, come on back in. And she is material for national leadership. Although we have a good national leadership of the party now, they're doing good work and they're trying to bring the party up and rebuild from 91 setback. And I think we are rebuilding, and we appreciate all of our comrades in top leadership. And they're mature enough to hear disagreement and respond to it. So John Bechtel, Joe Sims, all of them. By the way, Joe Sims wrote a wonderful pamphlet on why African Americans should join the Communist Party. That's an old one, and I hear they're renewing it now, and I hope we'll get it together. It's not easy to do this stuff. It really isn't, and it's hard for people to see themselves taking on that full-time thing. But the door is open. Come on in. You could become a part of it. And I think um, the measure of your contribution will be the measure of how high you can go in the party, you know? So anyway, but thanks for your remarks. And when are we coming to Hawaii? I'm joking. Well, nice time of year to be there.
Is there a question in New York from the audience?
Yeah, I have a question. The role of the Communist Party in breaking color bar in baseball.
The role of the Communist Party in breaking the color bar in baseball. Thanks for raising that, Bernie. I appreciate that. It was a great thing. I'll get you next, because we got two questions here. Just on that, I think it's really important people to know that, you know, the Negro League was there for a reason, because they wouldn't let them into the regular league. And there were some really fabulous players in the Negro League of baseball. But they had a rough life, and they didn't make much money, and they didn't get much fame. And so the sports reporter for the Daily Worker was the first to wage a campaign to integrate professional football, baseball. Football is another one, but professional baseball. And he led a crusade. People went to the games with signs. Trade unions endorsed the idea. Union members came and stood up and expressed their point of view, showing their signs about the need to integrate baseball. Branch Rickey, being a wise man, ultimately agreed to do it. But he wouldn't have done it. What Paul Robeson and William L. Patterson went to visit him, actually sat down with him and talked to him about the need to integrate baseball. And then he said, well, we got to find a Negro who was acceptable and all of that. And they chose Jackie Robinson, who came from California, college kid, smart, and a terrific player. And he was the first to go on the Dodgers. And the rest is history. But it actually was the Young Communist League and the Communist Party and the Communist Press that led that fight to integrate baseball. Ben Davis and Pete Caccione, they were in city council then. Right. No, thanks for that. One more question back there.
Thank you for a great presentation. But in recent days or weeks, there has been much recognition when it comes to political rhetoric about the recognition of Haiti and Africa and whatnot. I'd like to know, my question is there any way that Black history can be part of the curriculum when it comes to public school, education? Because
some of the current.
well, yes, because Black history, as far as I'm concerned, should be taught nationwide at schools. Because I'm from the Caribbean, and we have something called Black history, and that's part of the subject. So we grew up knowing the history of the Caribbean when it comes to the slave trade and everything like this. And I think the same thing should be applied to these countries, because it's not only just for adults, but the kids who are growing up, they're not aware of the history. And I think that should be part of the curriculum.
Okay.
Nationwide, it's not just even doing lots of history.
Well, actually, the party is trying to do it nationwide.
Okay, the static has begun again. The static.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
Just started right now. Still there?
Yeah, the static has begun again.
Oh boy. Stevens has a network. Because I think maybe the hour. No.
I think someone in the audience has the program open either on their phone or on a computer, and they have.
True? Anybody have that? Because you're getting a little echo or something.
We're getting static and we're getting an echo.
Yeah. Oh boy. Well, the question. So I can't tell you what the question is. I don't know if you heard the question.
I think that's network.
Yeah. Testing. One, two, three. Still doing it.
Yes.
Yeah. He's working on it.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah, still the same.
No, it's perfect.
What did you say?
It's perfect.
It's perfect. Oh, good. So the comrade here was asking about Black history should be used as a way to mobilize the current political situation we have nowadays. Is that kind of what you were saying, or am I got it wrong?
No, I said it should be part of the school curriculum.
Oh, school curriculum. You know, they have it in a lot of schools, but it's so shallow. You know, this one did this, that one did this. Never about the oppression and the struggle. We got a history of struggle. That is the main part about it. That we were confronted with this horrible condition and we fought to change it and did change it, even though the fight continues. That is not given proper consideration.
I don't want to make comparison between the Caribbean and here because our system is totally different. It's mandatory. There is a book called West Indian History, and it covers everything. And this is a subject you have to take history. That's it. Black West Indian history. That's what it's called. West Indian history. We know the history of the North and South America, and including the Caribbean.
She's talking about in the Caribbean how they have books and literature about the whole history of South America, of the Caribbean, and the whole existence of African American people. By the way, there are more African Americans outside of America than in. You know that, right? It goes all the way down to Brazil. I just want to say one thing though. The role of the Caribbean, people from the Caribbean to our struggle, invaluable. You know that the strongest, how should I put it, the African American who had the highest position in the labor movement back in the 40s and 50s was a guy named Ferdinand Smith. That's him right there, that handsome dude. See? Jamaican. He headed the National Maritime Union. He was the highest Black in the nation in the labor movement. That guy right there, Ferdinand Smith, Jamaican. Claudia Jones, great leader of our party, also Jamaican. No, I think she's from Trinidad. That's that woman right there. So there's a great,
Taylor.
huh?
Taylor. Right there. Bill Taylor, I think, is the corner.
Bill Taylor, you're right. He was from Nevis. He's from Nevis. Buddy of mine. Where's the picture of Bill? Oh,
Okay.
behind him, my buddy. What is this? Bill Taylor, my buddy. Anyway, he was the chairman of the party in Southern California. And when he reached an advanced age, his wife passed. He came to move to New York, and he was part of the national leadership. He was from Nevis, and he has a sister who was the first Black woman federal judge, Constant Motley. That was his. Yeah, that was his sister. Yeah. All right.
If we could take one more question. There's a question from the audience in Chicago.
Okay. Yeah. Jarvis, you hear me? Shelby.
Hey, Shelby, how you doing?
Hey, great. Very educational. My question is around heroes of the party. Those that you named, no doubt about them, giants. Such giants sometimes is intimidating. In our efforts in recruiting people out here in the streets, we tell those stories and it's appreciated. But sometimes I wonder if people conclude, well, these were really such giants of such magnitude and such brilliance. But I kind of think of, I remember when I first came to the party, one person who I was kind of intrigued about having studied but should more is Hosea Hudson. Hosea Hudson, which I would also say is a hero of the party and type of hero that there are a lot of people out there who can relate to. And here in Chicago, we have Frank Lumpkin, who I actually saw in life and was amazed at how he related to men, industrial workers, in ways that intellectual workers couldn't connect with, as far as I'm concerned. That's what impressed me about him as I would watch and study how he dealt with working people, working class. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Shelby. Let me just say, Chicago has produced more outstanding communist leaders maybe than any other place around in a lot of ways. Basic working class people. Frank Lumpkin, you mentioned, but Frank, who led that whole fight for Wisconsin Steel, always bring a crowd. Him and B always made a tremendous contribution. Pat Ellis, Al Ellis, Ishmael Flory, one of my old buddies, makes great grits and eggs. Many grits and eggs with Ish, who had a base and was a great distributor of the paper and a great leader on the south side of Chicago. So many. Claude Lightfoot. Actually, Claude and I were bunkmates for a long time when he lived in Brooklyn. So, you know, all I can say is that we have a rich history. We got to figure out how to put it out there and get it out there. It's a winner. I'm telling you, it is a winner. And for too long, we've let the bad guys distort what is going on. No communists will use you and all everything. You know, nothing could be further from the truth. There were always some communists who weren't always that great at dealing with people. I've got to be honest with you. But the overall experience of people of color in the party was a great one. And they contributed, and the party contributed to them. So I think that's the last question. D?
Yeah, we're going to sign off online, and we express our appreciation for your being with us tonight. And as was indicated, we have a lot to learn, a lot more stories to hear, and we look forward to the opportunities to do so.